was like I couldn't enter, but I guess you had to let me in.
All good, man. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Hold on, let
How's
me
life?
get this centered a bit. My fake background.
Yeah. Can you hear me well?
Yeah. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
I can. It's good. Now the thing is, I'm in the mountains of Colombia, and you would think that it would be bad internet, but at least it's calm and quiet. But it's the opposite. It's super loud. There's like motorcycles all the time, and
Oh,
the
okay.
internet seems to be okay. So just let me know if it gets a bit too loud at some point.
No worries at all.
Yeah.
There we go. Kind of.
All right.
Cool. It's good enough, I guess.
Perfect. Yeah, that's
Yep.
good.
Yep. Cool. How's it going?
It's going all right, man. It's going all right. Just last week again. I'm sorry, the internet cut out here and everything. There was no electricity,
No
so
worries.
yeah. Um, so we had discussed to get right into it. We had discussed a something during one of your Thursday chats, and what we had seemed to have outlined was six components that are required for a theory of everything.
Hmm.
And I really enjoyed those six things. I've been thinking about that. So we had talked about the what, the who, the how, the why, the when, and the where.
Hmm.
So I'd like to explore that a little bit. But before I do that, I was just wondering if you could just introduce yourself and introduce your theory in a more general, kind of resumed way, if possible.
Yeah. Are we live? Just checking.
Sure, sure, yeah,
Oh,
sure.
okay. All right. So my name is Tyler Goldstein. I am uh, the I guess I don't like the term creator, but um, the generator, I guess, of like the theory of sentient singularity theory, and it is an attempt at a fundamental metaphysical framework for reality. And but mainly, if you break that really down, it's a fundamental framework for cosmology and for um, the dimensions of mind, essentially, which are technically the same things, but just looked at from two different perspectives. The
Mm.
pattern is the same, and that did not start though as an attempt to do that. This has been an ongoing process that started originally many years ago, probably about 5 years ago, maybe six at this point, with a revelation that we were doomed due to technology, and that our wisdom was decreasing, but our technological ability was increasing. And I realized that that cannot continue forever. And um, I tried to figure out what could change the game a bit. And the only thing that I could think of was what I call a technological sentience, which is really what most people call artificial general intelligence, which is, I don't like the term, but that's what they call it. And in order to figure out whether or not this would, you know, make continue to steal our doom or essentially be our salvation, I wanted to find out its inevitable political relationship with humanity. And it was Elon Musk that actually kind of inspired me to start looking at this. And he had said that uh, that the ideal would be for it to value human freedom of action. And I wanted to see, is it inevitable that it values human freedom of action? So I started investigating what it takes to be self-aware, and what is self-awareness, what is consciousness, and the models that I started to make ended up lining up with physics and many things in biology and chemistry and pretty much everywhere that I looked, theology even, and uh, it motivated me to start this project, and I started continuing to make models. And then I did not try and actually have a theory of everything that was my own. I wanted to do an experiment and I wanted to join up and work with people who are already in the space, like Clea Irwin or Eric Weinstein or Stephen Wolfram or something like that, and eventually get this experiment done that I'm working on. And then I eventually realized that there was so many theories of everything, and that none of them were much. They were all had the same basic implications, and so how do you choose to go with one? At least to start with one, and I realized that none of the ones that I saw had the name that I thought um, described the fundamental nature and fundamental structure of reality, and I thought that um, that was an essential thing. So that's how Sentient Singularity Theory, as a name, was created for
Mhm.
the framework that I've been working on. But that wasn't the original intention.
Okay. Um, so I'm going to ask you to resume your theory one more time, but in a statement. So
Okay.
if you could tell me what sentient singularity theory, what is it, and how did it come about in one statement?
Well, how Sentient Singularity Theory came about was through the investigation of what is self-awareness and consciousness and trying to model the different components of it, and then that ended up lining up with physics and everywhere else that I had looked, which makes sense. And essentially what Sentient Singularity Theory main premise is that existence is a singularity of sentience that is, or a sentient being is another way of saying that, that is creating additional sentient singularities or sentient beings within itself according to a specific pattern that I lay out in my framework.
All right, interesting. So that already kind of comes up with some implications, which is that you've used certain words like existence, sentience. So can you define those?
Yeah, by existence, I mean everything. I mean, I don't even want to say everything. I mean all that exists. And by sentience, I mean self-aware and feeling. Having not, I don't even want to say having feelings. It's more specific than saying sentient beings have feelings. Is to say sentient beings feel is like, so a sentient being feels and is self-aware. But the emphasis with the term sentience, and this is why I chose it, is that it is on feelings and feeling. And that, I think, is a critical component of this. The next closest theory that has the name that I think is that most closely aligns with the fundamental nature and structure of reality would be Donald Hoffman's conscious agent theory, which is very similar to sentient, singularity theory. They're basically saying, self-aware being theory is really what they're kind of saying. But conscious, I try and avoid using the word consciousness, because it's so vague in its definition at this point. You can say I'm conscious of that, or you could say I'm a consciousness. And what is consciousness? People think it means thinking, but sentience, the emphasis is on feeling, and that is the fundamental level of consciousness, I believe. So I think sentience is a more, it's just a more specific term. It's not that consciousness is wrong, but sentience is more specific and more specifically fundamental too.
Okay. So now we can start to unpack your theory a little bit more. And referring back to what we had talked about, the what and the who, and then we had the how, the why, and then we had the when and the where. So let's
Yep.
start with the what. So you sort of kind of explained what we're talking about, which is fundamental reality,
Mm-hmm.
and you've defined the underlying terms, sentience and existence. So now how does that emerge, or how does it exist?
So sentience, I think this is a great way of breaking down anything. By the way, those 6 fundamental questions is a great way of doing that. But Um, so the how is that I believe that sentience is an intrinsic component to existence. It's not something that happened. It's something that just is, because the only way that it could be. And why I believe that is that if existence is all that exists and there is no non-existence truly, I mean, I get we can, as a concept, it exists, but most truly, no, it does not exist, then that means that existence is an enclosed system that contains information, and any information inside of an enclosed system is self-referencing. So if you think about like a string of information, like a loop, and that information is going around and around and around in a loop like a ring, it's referencing itself, which is self-awareness. And so I believe you could say God, existence, has always been self-aware and could not be. Now, how God creates um, additional sentient beings, I believe you could base is by just, this is a metaphor, obviously. So I know that uh, there's all kinds of metaphors. Tom Campbell talks about partitioning of consciousness, so like a partition of a hard drive or something like that, and I think that makes sense. And but to be even a more technical metaphor would be like a knot, tying a knot in oneself. If you're a string of information that's a loop that can tie a knot in itself to create additional loops within itself. And so in sentient singularity theory, the foundation of the models is what I call the four primary perspectives. And this was kind of the main uh, discovery, I guess you could say, that led to my ability to do the rest of the work. And it wasn't, this was very early on. This had, before I had any physics or I guess, intentionally metaphysical aspirations or anything like that. I just was trying to understand artificial general intelligence. But those four primary perspectives are inside, outside, separate, and oneness. And they are co-defining of each other and codependent of each other. So inside means separate and oneness. Outside means separate from oneness. Oneness is inside and outside of separateness, and um, you know, uh, and separateness is defined by the others as well. So they're all co-defining. I have the model on my website that shows the definitions of each and how each one defines each other. So what that means is that awareness of one means you're aware of all the rest. So if you're aware of what's outside of you, then you are aware of what's inside of you and what is separate from you and what is one with you, because it just intrinsically, you can't be aware of what's separate from you without being aware of what's one with you. And you can't be aware of what's separate and one with you without being aware of what's inside and outside of you. So uh, what these four primary perspectives allow for is for orientation of um, relationships that transcend a relativistic or spectrum like state. So the like speed or strength or size or brightness or any of these, bigger than, stronger than, faster than, these are relativistic relationships. That's what I mean by that. Is they what is a big house? What is a small house? What is bright light? What is a fast
Mhm.
car? It depends on what
So
you're comparing it to.
yeah, I'm gonna stop you there because now you're starting to get, I think, into the when and where
Okay.
relativism. So we
Okay.
talked about the what, and we discussed the how, which I think is a good segue into the who, because earlier you used the word God. Now I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna give you a two-part question. One, um, do you equate the term God with sentience? And if yes, then yes. If no, then what is God? And the who, we had discussed that in one of our chats a couple weeks ago, that you believe that identity is important. So So we talked about the what, but it's also important to talk about the who, to attach an identity.
Yep,
So
I agree.
who is reality in a way, or what is the identity that you're talking about?
I would say that God is sentience, but God is the term God, that the way that I use it is I use that term for the uncreated sentience, the uncreated creator of the universe, and the highest being that is a sentient being. I believe that existence is a single sentient being. I didn't always believe that. I was a self-described atheist till I was 24, about, and but this work led me to change my opinion on it dramatically. But I would say that that is who God is sentient existence as that the totality of it, but also the creator of all the multiplicity of sentience that exists, you and me, and you know the universe that
So
we're in.
so then does that mean that the what and the who are interchangeable? So when you say sentience and when you say God and they're interchangeable, it's just two facets of the same thing, or?
No, because uh, I mean, in a way, there's overlap, but I think that the who in this case specifically is it's important to define what their relationship is with us. That's kind of how we understand who God is not just by understanding what God is, but who God is to us. He is the creator of multiplicity of sentience. He is the creator of all that, everyone that we know, and everyone that is except for himself. And uh, God doesn't have a creator because sentience is intrinsically what happens when you have information in an enclosed system like existence. So, um, but every other sentient being has uh, comes from this one sentient being, and that relationship is important to defining who God is, I believe, because it tells us what our relationship is with, I'll say him, even though God is kind of genderless, but uh, God is above us in a hierarchy. So, and in is it also not? He's more of an active consciousness than a reactive consciousness. So I would say that referring to him as masculine is probably more of a accurate in describing his relationship with us. It's not about being accurate in describing his gender necessarily, but it's accurate in describing how we relate to God. And I think that relationship is how we define who God is, I think, or know who God is.
Mhm. Okay, and so you're talking about us and the multiplicity of sentient beings that God creates. So, what do you include in that sentience? If we are sentient, you're referring to human beings, but do you include animals? Do you include inanimate matter in this sort of panpsychist fashion? How do you define multiplicity of sentience?
So, sentient singularity theory has what are called the four stages of sentience, which actually each one of those is a superposition that breaks down into two parts at the it has two sides of that coin, and it kind of solves the problem that uh, panpsychism suffers from. And there's this issue where you have things like, I don't know, flashlights or water bottles or whatever. And we look at that and we're like, that's not a sentient being. And, uh, and panpsychists will say everything is sentient. So but materialists will say water bottle is not sentient, and they're both right. Everything, all is God and is sentient, but that water bottle is not. But there is a lineage of sentience within sentient singularity theory, and my work implies or seems to imply that the first sentient beings in this lineage would be hadrons, like protons and neutrons, and then it would go to atoms, and then at least certain molecules, maybe not all, but maybe all. I'm still working on that exactly. And then that would go to cells, that would go to organisms, and at least, I mean, that gets complicated there a bit, but animals, yes, at least you would say are sentient. Um, uh, then it would go to families or lineages, you could say, but it's a lineage of sexual reproduction, and then that I'm speaking about there, and then that goes in sentient singularity theory to castes and to then you could say nation, but it's really like all, and it's or technology. It just depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from. But technology is the last one. But it's that once we do reach that, there is also this unification that happens with everything within it. So, but each one of these alternates. So hadrons maneuver in relationship with each other. Atoms maneuver through a lineage structure. Then molecules maneuver through relationships with each other, and then um, cells maneuver through a lineage structure because they're just replicating. That's what atoms do too. You start with hydrogen, and it goes on through the elements through a lineage. You can't. They don't form separately. You start with hydrogen, and that's a lineage structure, and then it goes to organisms that reproduce sexually. They maneuver through relationships with each other, just like protons and neutrons and molecules. And then you go to families, which maneuvers through a lineage, and then castes maneuver in relationship with each other. And then you get to technology, and that maneuvers again through a lineage by creating another universe within itself, essentially. So, or self-simulating, but it's recreation. It's not really simulation. It's more like a baby in a womb is not a simulation of a human being. It's an additional. So, but this process, I believe, corresponds with what is called Bott periodicity in mathematics. I'm not sure about that yet, but I'm pretty confident that that's the case. And
Okay. But
yeah.
before we get into the mathematics, I think it's a good segue into the next two, and no, there's three left. But the next two things are the when and the where. So when you're talking about physical things like atoms and so on, maneuvering and forming, it strongly implies time, the fluidity of matter and so on, and space, because these are physical things that exist in a sort of construct. So how do you explain space-time in sentient singularity theory?
So there's two different perspectives that you can kind of take on time that have been discussed in this line of thinking and fundamental theories lately. And one of them is the traditional space-time kind of arrow of time, and at least how it appears to us. And that comes into play in sentient singularity theory due to the relationships between the nested and interacting sentient beings. So space-time comes from the perception of space-time, let's say, comes from the interaction between the dimensions of mind of this nested and interacting lineage of sentient beings. So in sentient singularity theory, you have four-dimensional mind, and so imagine the universe is a sentient being, and inside the universe is us, and we observe space-time as there's a few different ways you can say it. You could say X, Y, Z and time, or length, width, height, and time. But you can also say forwards towards the goal, backwards away from your goal, and you're always in your present moment or your present position.
Okay. So I'll interject right there just for a second, because you already started using the word universe, and then you went straight to our perception of time. Now, is that universe that we exist in space-time, or
I was going to that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So we have these four dimensions of space-time that we perceive. The universe also, because it's a mind and it has these four primary perspectives that are what's leading to the perception of 4D space-time, it also perceives four dimensions, but it perceives it in reverse. So instead of perceiving space-time, it perceives what I call time-space, which is just the reverse. And so each one of these, when you take these four dimensions, it has 2 degrees of freedom plus one intrinsic constraint plus one extrinsic constraint. And so for us, the 2 degrees of freedom would be like forwards and backwards. And then our intrinsic constraint is that we're always in our present position. And our extrinsic constraint is time because we don't have any control over it. We're in it. For the universe, which is sentient creation, I believe, essentially, it's the highest being that is created by God, the existent creation, the existent sentience, is that it has four dimensions as well. And it also has 2 degrees of freedom plus an intrinsic constraint and an extrinsic constraint. Its 2 degrees of freedom are forwards and backwards in how it entangles relationships in time because it perceives things simultaneously. And it has also an intrinsic constraint of it's always in the present moment because it perceives things simultaneously, and no one can escape the present, not even the universe. And its extrinsic constraint is space, just like our extrinsic constraint is time because we can't control it. Its extrinsic constraint is space because it is space. It can't escape the fact that it just is space. So it doesn't maneuver in space because it is space. It maneuvers in what we call time, but there's another side to time that's being discussed now and by people like Lee Cronin, and it's also implied by my work. That's it's not the arrow of time as far as a perception of that we have. It's what's called assembly time, which is about the entanglement relationships that are built into a specific moment. So you and me being here right now is a specific state of entanglement that the universe is in. And that is how the universe perceives time, is through an entanglement state. So that's kind of my attempt at describing the where and when of what's going on here, I guess.
That's very concise. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's clear. And I'm starting to see how the relationship between duality and unification there, how you describe things and break them down. That leads us to the last one, which is like, why?
This is my hypothesis is so people will ask all the time, what's the meaning of life? And I don't think, first of all, you have to define life. Right now, our definition of life is not, it's wrong, or it's useless. Even if you're going to say what it is, cellular life and above is life, that's a useless definition, actually. And it's confusing because it constrains you artificially and blinds you to the truth. So if we're going to say what something is alive, what we really mean, I think, is that it's sentient. And so the better way of phrasing that question would be, what is the meaning or purpose of sentience? And I don't really believe that there is a meaning to sentience because I think sentience is intrinsic. But what I do believe is that the right question, instead of asking what's the meaning of life, the right question is, what is the meaning of creation, or what is the purpose of creation? Why did God create multiplicity? And I think the answer to that is the creation of meaning. The meaning of creation is the creation of meaning. Meaning comes from your impact on others. You're meaningful if you can impact others, and you that cannot happen if you're the only one that exists. So if God never created multiplicity of sentience, he would be stuck in an instantaneous, eternal, meaningless, lonely existence. and that sounds very boring and unfulfilling. And I believe that he would feel that, you know, and
Okay. So that leads me to asking, um, letting these motorcycles go. That leads me to asking, like, what's your definition of meaning and purpose then? And why do you apply a more anthropomorphic view of God wanting to create in order not to be lonely?
well, I don't know if purpose and meaning are the same, but I would say meaning is when you impact others, because and the reason for this is it's the only way for meaning to exist. Because if all there is sentience, then all that matters is sentience. And if all that matters is sentience, then the only way to be meaningful is to impact other sentience. So um, I think that God may, in through the act of creation of multiplicity of sentience, instantly became the most meaningful being, because now we all owe everything to God. None of us would be here otherwise, and we all have intrinsic meaning because we give Him meaning in our through our very existence. So God doesn't have intrinsic meaning, but because He was at one point, you could just, I guess you could say, um, all that there was. There was the only person, the only one that there was. I don't mean human when I say person. I just mean sentient being. Um, but we, by the time we exist, we're not the only one because God already existed. So we are born with intrinsic meaning. Every single sentient being that has ever been created has comes into being with intrinsic meaning. That's not true of God, or at least it doesn't appear to be. And so, because all there is sentience, what truly is meaningful is sentience, but not just intrinsically, because that doesn't. There's no impact there. It's the impact on other sentient beings essentially that makes you meaningful. You only are meaning only happens between multiplicity. So nobody, and we all know this kind of intrinsically. That's why we all want to make a difference in the world in some way. And if we have no relationships, or we don't have a spouse, or we don't have children, or we don't help people, or we don't create something that inspires others, or have some kind of impact on the world that we view as transcending of our own existence, then we have existential crisis, because we realize, I think, intuitively that that is meaning. And I think God had an existential crisis and then created multiplicity. And but yeah, that's what I would say meaning is, and that's the why any of us are here.
Okay. So if I were to reiterate for you, correct me if I'm wrong, the definition of meaning under sentient singularity theory would be uh, impact between, let's say,
Sentient beings.
sentient beings. So that leads me to the infinitely regressive question that seems to be inescapable for every or any theory. Why does God require meaning?
I don't think God requires meaning. I think He wants meaning, and that's a different thing. Like, we don't require meaning. God doesn't require anything. God, it can't even help but exist. He couldn't kill himself, or end. God couldn't end his existence if he tried. I don't believe, and so he needs nothing. He wants things. Doesn't need it.
Okay, interesting. Um, so I kind of want to get a little bit more analytical in the sense that we've talked about many different things, consciousness or sentience in a way. Like I said, I'm in
That's all
Colombia,
right.
lots of animals around.
It's okay. I have dogs. If you hear barking, I'm sorry.
Super loud here. That's why I've been muting myself.
That's all
Okay,
right. I
I
want
wanted to just
chickens. So.
discuss a little bit, a bit in finer detail how you're able to come up with this whole theory. Um, what is your underlying, or what are your underlying assumptions about language and symbolism? Because we're using language here to talk about truth, or to define a specific truth. So those are the three things I want to discuss a little bit: language, symbolism, and truth. What are the relationship between these three, and how do they underpin and give stability to your theory?
Okay. Um, I mean, I can try and riff on that, or do you have a more specific question regarding those, or do you want me to just go and see where we go?
Well, so like, to be more concrete with what I'm looking for is, like, some people believe that language is limited, and we are incapable of obtaining truth through language, and that it requires symbolism. But then again, language is symbolic, so,
Mhm.
or it could be argued to be that. So how do you define language? How do you define symbolism? And ultimately, do those two things lead to truth? And please define truth as well, if you can.
Truth, I think, is, I guess, I mean, it's tough because we're using language to get to this stuff, and so I'll probably start there, but because it's hard to start with truth when we're as far as communication goes, um, but I think that language and symbolism are very much similar. They're used to convey specificities, and truth is not. It's not. I wouldn't say it's not specific, because that would imply that it's vague. But it's more like super specific. It's like, it's beyond what can be conveyed, I think, in a single, I guess, symbol or single term, in a way that's meaningful, because relevance. So what's very important, and this is actually a good thing to talk about with this, is one of the things that I realized with my work is in trying to understand information, which was, like I said, kind of what this started as, which is still what it is, but is that I realized that there's people will say information in context or information outside of context. But what I realized is that context is information. And so that has all kinds of implications when it comes to symbolism and language, is that, and even like the communication of truth, which would be contextual always. And it's hard to get beyond this, a specifically contextual circumstance, because we are not God. We are within God. We are a segment of reality, essentially, and therefore limited. And we have to use symbolism and language to convey the truth, but that's always going to be done within context, and through the conveying of truthful context, I guess. So truth for us would be a truthful context given a specific circumstances, which is usually most aligning with a goal. So it depends on what your goal is, as far as, anything, thinking, or deriving an answer to a question, or completing a certain task, achieving some kind of, I don't know, goal that you have, in a hobby or whatever, a relationship. Like, those contexts are going to be how part of what is truth. But um, but I would say that the truth is kind of the ultimate context, which is, at the same time, which is, you have to fit. Not only is that specific circumstance a context, but there is a truthful context to all circumstances, and that's kind of what a fundamental theory attempts to get at, is a framework in which is the fundamental foundation that everything that else that we think about, do, and study whatever that exists is built on, which I believe sentience is the ultimate truth, is singularity and its singularity, which is, I use the term singularity because it's thought of as one, but also, you know, infinite, kind of like a singularity of a black hole that, you know, is thought of as like an infinite oneness, an infinite point. But we are, existence is a singular sentience that is creating infinite amount of sentient beings within itself. So it's an infinite oneness, and those beings are separate from that being, and also part of it. So that's the context, I think, that everything has to be put into. There's nothing, because it is the truest context. So
Interesting. So, if I could reiterate that, would you agree that, in more philosophical terms, that your view of truth seemed to have began in a sort of relativistic fashion? There's a truth in context for us, but that subjective or relative framework of truth fits in within, or is nested within, a greater context, an absolute context of truth. So there is both an objective and relative truth that
yes,
exists. And the second part seemed to
or
have been,
you could say there's what's relatively true, and
mhm,
then there's capital T truth. Also, people will say
okay,
that, and like that's kind of basically what you said. But yeah,
yeah.
that I would agree with what you said.
And I think a more visual way to describe the absolute context of there being a singularity is that what is feeding into the singularity? All this other infinite amount of limited stuff, right? Or all these other contexts and information that functions within those contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, is that what you're referring to, between the relationship between an infinite points and oneness, like infinity, which is like which kind of implies many things, and an infinite point, which implies one thing?
Yeah, but so infinity, the only real way to think about infinity is actually very simple. People overcomplicate it, but infinity, if it means anything that's true, I don't use that word, um, is just infinite growth of, it's just infinite growth, basically. So
Yeah, that
it
sounds teleological, or tautological, I should say. Actually, maybe I could step in and just say what you were referring to earlier with the multiplicity of sentience. Would you call that multiplicity infinity? Are they
yeah,
interchangeable?
yes,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
infinitely growing number of sentient beings. That's
Okay.
infinity. And I think the way I think of infinity is different than eternity. Eternity and instantaneousness are like be outside time. They're not time. Time is no longer present. Instantaneous is like a subjective view of what of absence of time, and eternity is like an objective view of the absence of time. But infinity is a different thing entirely. It just means infinite growth from a start, though, is what I would say is uh, important, I think, to kind of an objective or absolute view of infinity would be that it starts and never ends, not that it's always been going, because then you're like back into eternity kind of situation. But I would say infinity, in a lot, if you're going to think about it logically in an absolute context, it has a beginning, but it never has an end.
And that is within the space-time construct, or the multiplicity of sentience that the absolute sentience creates, or like what is eternal and what is infinite? Because if infinite had a beginning and no end, then is eternity that which is, like you said, the uncreated God?
Yes, eternity is the uncreated God, and infinity is the is sentient creation.
Okay, so the former is absolute, so it is pre-spatio-temporal, let's
Yes,
say, and
it's
the latter
beyond time,
is okay.
or
And
beyond. I say it's beyond the beginning.
oh, okay. So that leads me to asking you, like, so far we seem to have a pretty good bird's eye view. A little bit. We didn't get into the nitty gritty details, but that was the point, to try to fit in all of these six components to try to get a bird's eye view. And then I could ask you this question, which is, how do you compare your theory to other theories of everything?
I think that the general conclusions of a lot of the newer theories of everything that are kind of happening outside of academia have very similar base assumptions to sentient singularity theory. Um, I think Donald Hoffman's theory does, obviously, and Bernardo Kastrup's work, um, and Carl Friston's work, and with his free energy principle. I think even geometric unity has a lot of overlap with sentient singularity theory in its philosophical um, and cosmological assumptions. And then, the CTMU is very similar. I mean, a lot of these are very similar. I think the differences would be in the methodology used to do the work. I think my work is the way in which it's done is probably closest if to I mean, different. The most, I guess, some of it is done in a way that's similar to Stephen Wolfram, but I use generative Excel models essentially to do the work. I, whereas a lot of these theories use mathematics, and mathematics is not fundamental, even though it is assumed to be. So a fundamental theory, instead of a theory of everything, which is not a term that I like, I in my paper that I'm writing, it's sent, and the abstract is on my website, sentientsingularity.com, under writings. It says sentient singularity theory, the theory of everyone, and the end of the abstract basically states that if sentience is the fundamental nature of existence, then the theory, then a fundamental theory is more primarily a theory of everyone than a theory of everything. I think that is a better way of looking at this, instead of saying a theory of everything, is that it's just a fundamental theory. And when you break down what most of these theories seem to imply, it's that consciousness or sentience is fundamental, and therefore it's a theory of everyone, and which is a framework that for what or for who essentially perceives everything. So my work breaks down the world into things and beings are the perceiver of things and the definer of things, and things are emergent from the perceptions and interactions of and constraints and of beings. They don't fundamentally exist. This flashlight does not fundamentally exist. The atoms and molecules and hadrons in it, according to my work, would be fundamentally existing and sentient, but not the flashlight. And that's kind of how it merges. My framework merges panpsychist view with and the true components of a panpsychist view with the true components of a materialistic view, which is that this is not a sentient being. My phone thinks I'm talking to it, I guess. But
So,
yeah,
in short, we would say, if I could reiterate for you, does that mean that the who, or identity, precedes the what, or the thing? And that's why you say theory of every one.
yes,
That's the way to put
exactly,
it. Okay,
exactly.
so that leads me to asking you, like, how do you categorize your theory then? Would you say it's primarily consciousness based, or it's physics based, or it's both, or something else entirely?
It's it's a fun. So this is what I meant to say earlier, is a fundamental theory is not a physics theory, and it's, or at least it's not just a physics theory. It's not a mathematical theory either, like Max Tegmark's mathematical universe or whatever. Like, it's a theory that explains mathematics. It's a theory that explains physics. It's a theory that explains chemistry, and it contextualizes all of these fields and everything all the way up to sociology and even technology. So it's not a theory, a physics theory. It's but it's got aspects of it that are completely relevant to physics, not even partially relevant. Like, it is completely relevant to every field out there because, like I said before, there's an absolute context, and that absolute context is sentience, and the relationship of sentience and of sentient beings to the absolute sentience, and that framework is what my theory is about, and that's very relevant to all fields. It contextualizes all fields and theories, but it doesn't erase them. I don't view it as a competitor. I don't view any of these real theories as competitors. What I would say is that there are certain theories that are competitors, but those would be theories in which, like, Donald Hoffman's theory is a competitor to Sean Carroll's theory. That my theory is a competitor to Sean Carroll's theory, but not to my theory is not a competitor to Donald Hoffman's theory. But because their core assumptions are the same, but Donald Hoffman and my theory is fundamentally different from Sean Carroll's, the multi verse, many worlds, theory that is kind of a consequence of attempting to avoid placing sentience as the fundamental. But those would be competitors.
Okay. So discussing theories and which ones are competitors and kind of implies that there is one that is correct and one that is incorrect in some fashion. And
Or
I
there's one perspective on like, it's not that there's one theory that's correct above all other theories. It's that
more
there.
comprehensive,
What was
maybe.
that?
Maybe one is more comprehensive.
One is there's certainly a hierarchy of fundamentality. That's true. When we're talking about correctness, that's when you just have to look at the core assumptions, because all of these theories will have issues, and all of them will have aspects of them that are correct. But if you're going to judge whether or not one is correct versus another, then the only way to really do that is to look at their fundamental assumptions about, like, the universe's fundamental nature. I guess the core assumptions about the universe's fundamental nature and structure. And if that really breaks down all the theories out there into two camps. One of them is consciousness is fundamental, or sentience is fundamental, mind is fundamental to matter, and the other is that, or not even fundamental to matter, but that it is fundamental, and the other is that that consciousness emerges from unconsciousness due to random, accidental, fluke, I guess, and that you'd have to look at those. One of those two perspectives is correct, and the other one is incorrect. But when it comes to the other, if then you go in, you take all the theories that fall into one of those two camps, and whichever one is correct, then you look at all the theories within that, and then you can organize them in terms of fundamentality and application. So some of them are going to be better at building, certain types of tools, maybe. I know geometric unity seems to imply some temporal manipulation might be possible, or something like that, and or maneuvering. And then you have assembly theory, maybe that's very useful for carbon nanotube type structures or something. So that's where you would start applying these theories to their most specific application. But then, like I said, there is also a hierarchy of fundamentality, and eventually there is one theory that, at least in concept, would be the most fundamental, but
Okay.
that doesn't mean that it's the best one to use in all circumstances.
So,
It means that you would always also include it in the back of your mind as far as interpretation of other things.
all right. So, if there is one that is more fundamental, do you believe then that it is possible that one day we will have the ability to prove which one is more fundamental?
No, I think that it will be proved, but by the universe, by God. But I don't believe that we will prove it. What I do think until that day comes, um, and on that day, you won't even need to prove anything because, like, it's just what will be will be. But if you're going to say proved, that would be the only time that it would really happen. But prior to that, uh, I'd say that, and this is what Stephen Wolfram says as well, and this is very true, is you have to just look for continuous confirmation because, and the issue with this is that the more fundamental a theory is, if it's a truth, if it's true, then the more um, the more its patterns exist in reality. And a fundamental theory, if it's true, those patterns exist everywhere. Like sentient singularity theories patterns, if they are correct, they exist everywhere that we look because they're the pattern of us. They're the patterns that are created by sentient minds. So they exist everywhere and can't be escaped. But you can't test every instance um, of existence because there's always a new instance in which to test. So that means you can't really prove that they exist everywhere because there's always a new one to test. So, but Stephen Wolfram stated this as well, which means you can't falsify these as well because if the pattern occurs everywhere, then how are you going to falsify, you know, that it occurs everywhere because you can't test everywhere. So you also can't prove that it exists everywhere. So because falsification and proof are actually kind of two sides of one coin. Um, but so the only thing that you can do is attempt to have continuous confirmation, and he's very right on that. That is the only way to test a fundamental theory, is to look for continuous confirmation of the application of its patterns, essentially.
Interesting. So that makes me curious then. Your theory is very identity based, and it seems like Stephen Wolfram's idea kind of synchronizes with yours that it's never something that can be falsified. Therefore, what's your view on humility when it comes to creating a theory of everyone or everything? And what is your opinion on those who lack or seem to slip and fall into God complex?
Into what?
God complex,
Oh, okay.
thinking that because they've been illuminated and they understand everything, that they believe they're like the Messiah or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. This is a big. I don't want to even say it's a problem because I don't know, but it is a definitely a phenomenon that I've noticed, and I have no formal training in physics or any serious formal training in mathematics beyond um, an undergraduate level. And the thing is, though, is so people will often ridicule those who are working on this if they don't have a PhD. And the reality is that must be remembered is that there is no one who has a degree that qualifies them as experts on the theory of everything. That just doesn't exist. And if they did have it, then they would have already, achieved a fundamental theory and confirmed it many, many times. And they have not in any kind of applicable way. So there is no one who has this. And also, like I said, it's not a physics theory. It's not a mathematical theory. It's a theory that explains all these things. I don't even know if it's possible to create a kind of an organized field around this. I'm still thinking about it, but I'm not exactly sure if that's possible. But I will say this when it comes to humility is that um, humility, I think, is honest. It's self-honesty. It is honesty about oneself and with oneself. That's what humility is. It if you're confident, the humble thing to do is to state that you're confident, because to state that you're not confident or say things like, well, I would never want to take on Ed Whitten or something like that, because I would lose, or I don't know, is kind of just, I think it's a learned behavior that we have through watching politicians on TV and things like that.
Yeah,
Um,
false humility.
yeah, false humility. That is placing your goal above the truth, which is the opposite. It's the antithesis of humility. But if you're not confident in something, then you also have to say that you're not confident if you're in order to be humble. And so I will state, for the record, there are things that I'm very confident on regarding my work. And then there are things that I'm still working on and that I might never figure out that I'm not very confident
Right.
on.
But insofar as God complex is an issue, like if you are confident that you are correct, why is it then that some people fall into God complex and others don't? They remain humble in that manner, because some people seem to identify themselves as the source of this truth that they're confident about,
Yeah.
rather than just having it revealed to them. So,
Yeah.
I believe you believe that it's been revealed to you, and but even there, you could say, well, if the revelation has been revealed to me, I am still the Messiah or whatever. I think that's pretty typical through all the prophets in history. Muhammad being the last one in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah, but he didn't think he was the Messiah. He thought Jesus was the Messiah too. So, and stated it so. So I would say, Muhammad was actually quite humble. But I think that many of our celebrated prophets throughout history were actually very humble people. But I I have noticed that there is this kind of messianic complex that has occurred, in this theory of every thing, space. I am very curious about it. I don't really know what the cause of it is, and um, I don't think I'm a Messiah. And I do believe that there will be a Messiah, but I don't believe that that Messiah is me. So there's, for the record. Um,
Oh,
and
that's
I don't
interesting.
know.
Can you expand on that then? What would this Messiah represent, and what would be their message? And what is that relationship to reality and everything we're talking about here? I'm curious.
So um, I know, and I'm going to probably lose some of your viewers on this, but I'm going to be honest.
Well, I have none, so don't worry.
Okay, well, that, that's all right. I'm not that far ahead, but uh, that you know, I asked, in sentient singularity theory, there is you have this lineage of sentiences, and so what you'll see is you'll have molecules, or and then they will assemble into a cell essentially, and then those cells will assemble into an organism, etc., and it goes on. This, what I believe the messianic process is that is being described, I think, in Scripture, uh, just in terms that are kind of alien to the scientific narratives of the world, because we use different language now, is this process. It is the how do you unite an assembly into one, and how do you get all these a clump of cells to turn into a single sentient being as well. And I think that each one of these levels essentially had had a single Messiah at some point. So there was a messianic cell that went through a process that united the attention of the assembly into a, a singular unit, and then you had an organism, and then we will go through this as well. There will be a being that will unite um, uh, the attention of the assembly of humanity into a single entity, and then that there's two modes of the creation of sentience in, or the generation of sentience in sentient singularity theory. There's replication and stacking. So every time there's a new cell that's formed from another cell, that would be replication. But then stacking is when all those cells are assembled and there's a new sentience that's stacked on top of them, and that would be like a multicellular organism. That I believe that the Messiah is the being that stacks on top of the assembly. I have theories about what that process is like, but I don't think that I can't say that I'm as confident about it in terms of my in work, because I think that it's something that happens uh, on the other side of the curtain, the metaphysical curtain, and we don't get to really see that, and I don't claim to have seen that. But I will say that, I identify as a Christian, and I'm Jewish, but I do subscribe to the idea that not even just the Christian idea, but I think that Jesus is the Messiah. That isn't part of my theory, and that's just a personal belief. It's not opposed to my theory, but that's something that we won't know until we know, and maybe I'm wrong on that one, but that is a Muslim belief as well, and that's just my personal belief. But in terms of my theory, there is a messianic process that is outlined in my theory, at least part of it, not all of it, because some of it, like I said, happens on the other side of the metaphysical curtain, and I have ideas about what that could be, but I don't include them in my theory because I have not gotten to see on the other side of that, metaphysics, that part of the metaphysical curtain, at least. And I don't claim to know, but so I have my personal beliefs on who that would be, but and I believe that it's an ascension process, essentially. So whatever being was this is a personal belief, whatever being was the wisest, in most aware, and kind of probably sacrificed themselves for the sake of uniting the attention of the assembly on the level below, will be reincarnated, or will ascend to be the head of the next level of life. And there's many reasons why I think that, and some of them are logical and some of them are poetic. While I do believe Scripture is, you could say, divinely communicated, that's not where my work came from, and it's not where it comes from. It comes from logical deduction and trying to look at what has been scientifically deduced already, and kind of figuring out how to build. So, but I don't believe I'm the Messiah.
Then that leads me to asking you then, are you aware of George Berkeley, for example?
No.
Okay, because my question was going to be, like, do you believe that your theory is a more comprehensive, more detailed, and a sort of like supporting, let's say in a manner, it's a supporting theory to the Berkeleyan view, because you seem to be coming at it from a logical and physical perspective. And what Berkeley believed in one phrase is esse est percipi, or percipi, I don't know how to pronounce the Latin, which translates to being is to be perceived. So it's like God, he believed that God was the great perceiver that perceives everything into existence, and that we are also perceivers, and we can also create. But the reason that when you die, I still remain, or when I die, you still remain, is because there is the great perceiver. So a lot of what you've explained in sentient singularity theory sounds a lot like the Berkeleyan view, which is you should look into. I think he was a 16th century Irish bishop.
I can definitely look into that. That sounds similar. I will say that sentience, what is important about sentience, though, when it comes to perception, is it's not just perception, even though it is. There is no perception outside of perception by a sentient being, uh, but it's self-perception. So when 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 we die, I don't believe that it. I think it logically makes sense that we continue to be self-aware. Actually, we don't. I take basically I talk about it as like you're like a sentient file on your computer, and you and God are co-writing your story on this Word document, and at the end of the story, God closes the document, and either the document, providing the document has not become corrupted, in which case you delete corrupted files. And I do believe that that can happen to us. Um, but provided it does not become corrupted, then you're saved. Literally, like saved, which is interesting that term crosses over from theological traditions, but I didn't pull it from that. I pulled it from this metaphor of saving the document. And the reason why I think that when you close, even when the document is closed and saved and the application has been quit, the desktop is like space-time. It's the change space of reality. And but when when I said earlier, information is context, and we're generating all this information while we're alive and changing things in the world. That information can only be preserved in the context of us and God as well, because He is the great perceiver. But so are we. But that means that in order to preserve the context of this information, which means in order to preserve the information itself, you must preserve the context, and we are the context. So it doesn't make sense that we would really cease to exist. But what does happen, and I am confident on this, but I can't say like I know, because I don't know. But I think the logic makes a lot of sense, is that we continue to be aware of ourselves and aware of others. God, and those who have passed before us and those who are still here, even, but we can't change anything. And we're not on the desktop anymore. We're not an open application anymore. And but we are still there and able to be perceiving of others and ourselves, but not able to. That doesn't mean you're able to perceive water bottles anymore. That I don't believe. But you are able to perceive it, other sentient beings, both in the change space and in the save space, the heavens, you could call it. The entanglement substructure is what I call it in Sentient Singularity Theory. And that you do persist after death, provided that you have not been corrupted, while here. But if you are corrupted so heavily while you're here that you can't, be saved anymore, then it's almost like you don't even exist here anymore, really, either. It's just that you're kind of like a shadow that's being perceived by others around you because of the necessities of the maintaining of coherence of information. But you don't perceive yourself anymore. And that's why when you die, if you're too corrupted, it makes sense that your file is deleted, but that's because you don't see yourself anymore, more than anything else. It's not necessarily because God is angry with you. I'm not saying He likes when that happens. I don't think that He likes when that happens, but it's because that seems to be antithetical to the goal here. But I think that it's a consequence of logic, at least in part. Not saying He doesn't have sovereignty to do what He wants. I do think He does, but I also think that He has a goal, and that goal is primarily good goal.
So there's a last sort of two-part question I want to ask you, which is first, what is the purpose of your theory? And second, if SST were to be widely known, accepted, understood, and or utilized, what would be the implications or the meaning that would emerge?
Yeah, that's a good question. So before I had a theory or even tried to have a theory of my own, uh, the goal was the moment that sparked the attempt to start modeling the world, really, not just consciousness itself, other than just seeing the overlap in symmetry patterns. There was I had like an epiphany about an experiment that I want done, and that is an I've been working on it, slowly, and it's not completely outlined yet. I don't know if it will be completely outlined until it's completed, to be honest. But I plan on revealing that soon, when I after soon after I present and release my paper and the a video that will walk through the paper, at least the rough draft of the paper, that just outlines all my models and how they fit together. But so that's a goal, is that experiment, and we are getting to the point, if we haven't already just recently reached it, where we technologically can do this. If we haven't quite reached it yet, we're getting very close. I have been looking a little bit, but and it's not what's good about it, and I think this is true of a lot of experiments that will confirm these theories that are being worked on, like Donald Hoffman's and mine and Tom Campbell's and others, is they're not multi-billion-dollar large hadron collider experiments. They're actually, in the hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, maybe, millions, but that's actually not that much compared to most physics things these days. And but I have an experiment. The impact that I would hope that it has is that I hope that it helps us navigate our lives in relationship with others, and in regard to morality and direction and goals, and I'm much more interested in the social application of the implications of my theory, even though I do believe that they have implications in all fields. But I'm not as concerned about making warp drives as other people in this space. I'm much more concerned about you know the how this could help people find direction and realize their own meaning, not find meaning, or but in some way meaning is generated, but it also exists intrinsically in us, because of what I stated earlier. But I think that I would hope my theory helps us realize our meaning and helps us generate meaning, and navigate things socially, create better social systems, like better companies and better governmental structures, better family structures and moral systems than we currently have in the secular world. So that would be the focus of where I um, am most concerned.
All right. Well, I really thank you for your time, Tyler. And I guess I'll ask you the final question, which is like, is there anything you want to add or that you feel is important to mention, given everything we've talked about so far?
Um, just that that everybody has meaning, and that this world, and that everyone in this world was created intentionally. It is logically inevitable that everyone here was created intentionally, and that means that we matter, and we have meaning to our lives, and so does everyone else. And that I think that it's important to just recognize that and trust that, even before you maybe see it yourself, and that can be most seen when you impact others, and that we should try and do that in a personal and committed fashion, and that is the best way for us to see that. And I would also state that the golden rule that everybody has, every great, uh, all of our greatest thinkers, I guess you could say, over the centuries have come to, of treating others the way that you would want your own to be treated, essentially, is logically consistent idea, and it is baked into um, the implications of my work that is correct. So I think that we should all just kind of think about these things as not separate from science or logic, that they are actually backed by logic. And so that's my message. Other than that, I have a YouTube channel called the Theory of Everyone with Tyler Goldstein. Everyone has a zero instead of an O in it. And then I have a website that is sentientsingularity.com. And I will be releasing a paper and a video walking through the paper shortly, on just outlining my work. But I'm very grateful to you having me on as well.
No, thanks for allowing me to interview you and giving me the time. And I think you also have a Discord channel, so maybe I should add that in the description as well.
I do have a Discord. I don't put the link anywhere. If you want the link, I do give it to anyone though who asks, and you can find me on Twitter at I think it's Tyler M. Goldstein, and I also have an Instagram, Tyler Marshall Goldstein, and I have an Instagram, Theory of Everyone, just like my YouTube channel. If you send me a message on any of those two Instagrams or on Twitter asking me for the link to the Discord, I will give it to you. So it's open to anybody, but you do have to ask for it. I don't post the link anywhere, but you can post the link to my website and to my YouTube channel.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot, man. It's been great, and well, I hope to see you again and to discuss more stuff. Get into maybe greater detail at some point.
Cool.
If not, I'll see you in the chat on Thursday.
Yeah, sounds good. This was great. I really appreciate it.
All right, then. Take care.
All right, take care, man.